How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Thursday. Let's light up the darkness. Who is in the house? We're going to do some highlights of 3 dafs. We're going to get then we'll end up 2 pages behind. But tomorrow is a key daf. So we won't do a triple tomorrow, and we'll just run a few pages behind until, we come to places where we can do a double page and get caught up as we've done in the past. Who's in the house? Lucy in Minnesota, Paul in the Great Northwest, Bill in Mid-Missouri, Shandora in the Bronx, Bella in Florida, Joe in the Inland Empire, Ella saying shalom, Frank in San Pedro, Sharon in New Jersey, Aoife in Florida, Marie in Freeport, Ilanit in Silver Spring, Chaim in Florida. Welcome, everybody. Also, Guy in Ohio, Bell in Texas. Our dafs today are pages 80, 81, and 82 here in Tractate Bava Kamma, the 21st volume of the Talmud. We are coming to the end of chapter 7. Right now, doing Mishna number 7 of chapter 7. We begin with the Mishna. One may not raise small domesticated animals, i.e. sheep and goats, in settled areas of Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. Why are we talking about raising sheep and goats in the land of Israel? I thought this was about damages, this tractate, right? We started by talking about if your ox injures another person, if your fire or your pit, or if you wound another person, what kind of damages you're going to be liable to. Then we talked about the penalties that a thief would incur beyond simple restitution if he stole your property, which would be the 2-fold payment. But if he stole your sheep or your ox, then it would be a 4-fold or 5-fold payment if he also then sold or slaughtered your sheep or your ox. So what is this about small domesticated animals cannot be raised in Eretz Yisrael? And the reason is because they graze on people's crops, right? So we're still talking about damages that your property could do to the property of another. And in this case, that your sheep or goats might go graze in another person's field. Now, this is a bit surprising, isn't it? I mean, you can't raise sheep and goats in Eretz Yisrael. Now, Eretz Yisrael is different than Medinas Yisrael, right? The state of Israel, the modern state of Israel, is not, sadly, is not run according to Torah law, in terms of the sovereignty of the state of Israel. Thank God it is a Jewish state, but it is not run by a Sanhedrin according to Torah law. So there probably are people raising sheep and goats in the land of Israel. But even if we think about ancient times, wasn't David a shepherd, right? Wasn't David a shepherd? Now, perhaps David was a shepherd, and these laws were a little bit later. And it's really a fence around the Torah. It's certainly not a written Torah prohibition that you can't raise sheep and goats in Israel. But the nature of that profession, I guess as it was practiced in ancient times, is that your sheep or goats would end up eating other people's property. And so to make a fence around the Torah to protect people from coming to take other people's property in that way, to steal it, to commit theft, this was prohibited. And of course, there are limitations on this law, as we shall see. So, one may not raise small domesticated animals, meaning sheep and goats, in the settled areas of Eretz Yisrael, where there's wilderness. Yes, you can, because they graze on people's crops. But one may raise these animals in Syria, despite the fact that with regard to many other laws, many other halachas, Syria is treated like the land of Israel and in the wilderness of Eretz Yisrael, right? So one may not raise chickens in Jerusalem due to the sacrificial meat that is common there, and there is a concern that chickens will pick up garbage that imparts ritual impurity, tuma, and bring it into contact with sacrificial meat. Now, obviously, when we're talking about sacrificial meat, this is because when the temple is standing and people are bringing their sacrifices up to Jerusalem to be offered there. When the temple is not standing, as it hasn't in about 2,000 years, we'll see if that remains the law, even in the absence of the situation which caused the ordinance to be passed. So there's a concern that chickens will pick up garbage that imparts tuma and bring it into contact with the sacrificial meat, thereby rendering it ritually impure. And priests may not raise chickens anywhere in Eretz Yisrael because of the many foods in a priest's possession that must be kept ritually pure, meaning teruma, right? So the first tithe of farmers in Israel, the 2% that goes to a Kohen, to a priest, that's teruma. And both the teruma and the priest himself must be in a state of ritual purity, tahara, for him to be able to eat the teruma. Furthermore, one may not raise pigs anywhere, meaning Jews may not raise pigs anywhere, and a person may not raise a dog unless it is tied with chains. One may spread out traps, known as nishavim, for pigeons only if this was performed at a distance of at least 30 ris, which is 8,000 cubits, so about 12,000 feet, we're talking a couple miles, away from any settled area, to ensure that privately owned pigeons are not caught in those traps. That's the Mishna. Now the Gemara. The sage is taught in a baraisa, one may not raise small domesticated animals, meaning sheep and goats, in settled areas of Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, but one may raise them in the forests of Eretz Yisrael. In Syria, it is permitted to do so even in a settled area, and needless to say, it is permitted to do so outside of Eretz Yisrael. Now, here's an interesting note about this from Rav Steinsaltz. Rashi explains that small animals tend to wander off with or without the shepherd's knowledge and graze on other people's land, thereby damaging their crops. Although this concern also applies outside of Eretz Yisrael, the sages did not impose their decree there. Rather, they left it up to the injured party in such cases to sue the offender for damages. By contrast, in Eretz Yisrael, the sages wanted to avoid any damage to agricultural fields. Why? In order to bolster and enhance the settlement of the land, right? So you're talking about different periods in history where you could see that, first of all, so it is a mitzvah for Jews to live in Israel, right? So some would say, well, now that there is a Jewish state in the land of Israel, why aren't all Jews living there? It's a good question. But at any rate, there were times, like for example, at the end of the first temple period, when Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the first temple and Jerusalem and exiled all the Jews, right? So all the Jews were taken out of Israel. Some remained even in that period, but a huge number were taken out. And then after the 70-year Babylonian exile, the period between the first and second temple, so then many Jews came back, led by Ezra, Nehemiah, right? And there was the reestablishing of the temple. And the second temple was a more modest structure with fewer daily miracles associated with it. And there was a need to repopulate the land, right? So many Jews had left. There was just huge empty areas, a little bit similar to the status of the land in the 20th century, right? So prior to the creation of the modern state of Israel, there were Jews living there. There were other people living there. But it was very sparse, right? I mean, it was Mark Twain wrote about it in the 1800s. He took a tour of the Holy Land. Yeah, there was Jerusalem, there was Sfat, there was some other holy cities, but most of it was just an absolute wilderness that you could walk for days and not run into people. And there was a desire to settle the land, to bring people in. And so this was the kind of policy that would actually help the farmers who were being encouraged to come back and help the land to flourish, right? So not only in modern times, but in ancient times, they had this same desire. There was always a Jewish community in the land of Israel, particularly in Jerusalem, but many of the more outlying areas were just not inhabited by anybody, and they wanted to bring people in. Okay, since we're doing 3 pages, we're just going to skip a little bit. And even though they said that one may not raise small domesticated animals, however, one may keep these animals on his premises for 30 days before a pilgrimage festival and 30 days before the wedding feast of one's son, when many animals are needed for food, provided that he does not leave the last one, i.e. the animal which he purchased immediately before the festival, for 30 days. Meaning that you can keep these animals, which you're not allowed, right, to keep a flock of sheep in a settled area. You can keep some that you're going to use for a festival, but then once the festival comes, let's say, because they said you could keep it for 30 days or until the festival. So if the festival comes, 1 week after you brought the animals, you can't then say, well, we didn't eat these animals. We didn't need them during the festival, and you said I could keep it for 30 days, so I'm going to keep it, for another 3 weeks after the festival is passed. No, it's for 30 days or until the next festival comes, whichever comes sooner. Now we're on page 80. Skip a few more paragraphs. So the sages taught in a Baraisa, if there is a shepherd of small domesticated animals who repented, the court does not obligate him to sell all his animals immediately, right? In other words, he has a shepherd who has a flock, and he's not adhering to this ordinance, this decree passed by the sages of not having a flock of sheep or goats in the settled areas of Eretz Yisrael. And then he repented. He said, you know what? Who am I to defy the will of the sages? I'm going to now start adhering to the law. So they don't make him get rid of the flock immediately. Because then if he had to get rid of them all at once, he might have to really sacrifice the price, of the sheep and goats to get rid of them quickly, so he can diminish his flock more gradually. Rather, he may sell them gradually. And likewise, in the case of a convert who came into possession of dogs and pigs, right? So a Jew cannot be a pig farmer. That's just an absolute law according to the sages. And you shouldn't have dogs either. Now, that's interesting. Obviously, there are many Jewish people today who have dogs. In the religious community, some people here and there will have a dog as a pet, but mostly not. And it's because of laws like this. Now, the concept was that dogs could be vicious dogs. There was just not a kind of settled tradition and practice among the Jews in Israel to have dogs as pets. Obviously, people have had dogs as pets, much longer than we're talking about ancient times in Israel 2,000-3,000 years ago. But it was not really a tradition among the Jews. Certainly, the dogs had been used as farm animals and as shepherds' dogs. But in terms of, having them like in your house in the city, not such a common thing, mostly because of this fear that it would turn into a vicious wild animal. If that wasn't a fear, which is not with most pets, talk to your Rav about that. Talk to your local Orthodox rabbi. So let's see. And likewise, in the case of a convert who came into possession of dogs and pigs as part of his inheritance. So the court does not obligate him to sell them all off immediately. Rather, he may sell them gradually. And similarly, with regard to one who vowed to purchase a house or to marry a woman in Eretz Yisrael, the court does not obligate him to acquire the first house he comes across or to marry the first woman he sees immediately upon his arrival in the land of Israel. Rather, he may wait until he finds a house and a wife that are appropriate for him. And there was an incident involving a certain unmarried woman who had a son who was distressing her. And she jumped up and took an oath impulsively. And she said, "Any man who comes to marry me and will discipline my son, I will not turn him away." Well, unworthy men jumped at the opportunity to marry her. And when the matter came before the sages, they said she need not marry one of these unworthy men, as this woman's intention in her oath was certainly to marry only a man who is appropriate for her and will help her discipline this unruly son. Okay, skip a few more paragraphs. And then we have some stories, some colorful but quite disturbing incidents relating to the strictness of rabbinic decrees and the manner in which the sages enforce them, but also in the way that they defer to each other. So we're skipping forward. Now on page 80b, there are 3 laws that are listed as having been enacted by the sons of Rav Papa, right? So whenever we finish a tractate, we mention Rav Papa and his 10 sons. I think I've heard this before. I'm pretty sure the reason is, what a machaya, what a blessing that Rav Papa was not only a sage himself, but all 10 of his sons were also sages. He was truly able to transmit his values to the entire next generation. So then there's a mnemonic to help us remember which of his sons decreed about these laws. But the point is that the 3 laws are like this. The court sounds the alarm on Shabbos over a breakout of sores, and a door that is locked will not be opened quickly. And with regard to one who purchases a house in Eretz Yisrael, one writes a bill of sale for this transaction even on Shabbos. It should not enter your mind to think that the sages would say that just because we want to encourage settlement of the land of Israel, that we would violate Shabbos to write the bill of sale. That's not what is meant by that. There is circumvent. The idea is to do it quickly. You don't violate Shabbos to do it, but there's a mechanism to help you make sure that that deal is not lost. And says Rav Steinsaltz, these 3 laws are apparently unrelated. Nevertheless, it has been noted that they have a common theme: the importance of taking advantage of an opportunity that presents itself without delay. Accordingly, it is permitted to sound the alarm on Shabbos in a case of danger, as perhaps that moment is a time of grace when prayer is most efficacious, and so you let people know that some emergency is happening. Sadly, we learned this year how relevant that could be. October 7th happened on Shabbos. A door that is locked, as the Gemara later explains, is referring to an opportunity for ordination, right? So remember that some of the sages that we read their words actually never became rabbis, because when we're talking about the ordination of sages, that was something that, of course, they received smicha, that's ordination, from an older sage who was their teacher, but there were certain conditions. It wasn't like an established path that you go to rabbinical school and then receive ordination when you've completed a certain set of requirements. There was more of a special case for every person to receive his smicha. And sometimes the situation and the conditions didn't line up. And so we have certain sages that we read their works all the time, and they weren't actually rabbis. And so when you have this opportunity as a sage to get that ordination, you have to seize it. And that's right, as the Gemara later explains, this is referring to an opportunity for ordination which may not present itself again. And finally, with regard to purchasing a home in Eretz Yisrael, if the sale is not finalized at the first opportunity, the seller may change his mind. There were, if you know people who actually live in the old city of Jerusalem now, I know a few. That is a very, very special and rare privilege and opportunity, not just to live in Jerusalem, but to live in the old city of Jerusalem. The houses do not come up for sale very often. Politically, for Jews to buy property sort of outside the Jewish quarter in the old city, very, very difficult, very controversial at times. Shouldn't be, but it is. And so, laws like this can come up in situations like that. Okay, we're actually going to skip forward a little bit to the bottom of page 80b. And the sages taught in a Baraisa that Joshua stipulated 10 conditions when he apportioned Eretz Yisrael among the tribes. So now we're talking about when the children of Israel, right now in our yearly cycle of reading the Torah, we're in Torah portion B'Shalach. right, which is when the children of Israel crossed the Yam Suf, the Sea of Reeds, and will wander in the Midbar, in the wilderness, for it should have been 2 years, ended up being 40 years because of the people's lack of faith and despair in the incident of the spies. But eventually, at the end of the Torah, Moses is dying, gives his final, blessings and sermon, and urging the people to cleave to Torah and to adhere to their relationship with Hashem, with God. Moses dies at the end of the Torah, at the end of Deuteronomy, and the next book is Joshua. And in the book of Joshua, the children of Israel enter the land of Israel. They have the wars of conquest against the 7 Canaanite nations. Eventually, they are subdued, and they enter the land. And now Joshua apportions the land among the tribes. And at that time, he made these 10 stipulations that we're going to read about. Very interesting. Again, these are sort of policy measures to help with the settling of the land of Israel. So, what were the 10? The conditions are that people shall have the right to graze their animals in forests, even on private property, and that they shall have the right to gather wood from each other's fields to be used as animal fodder. And then what we're not going to have time to read today is all the limitations on the stipulations of Joshua. But it's not that you could just go into somebody else's property and gather fodder for your animals. It's that certain kinds of loose twigs, that are not really being used for anything, you could get some of that to feed your animals. So for every one of these stipulations, there's also going to be limitations. But at any rate, Joshua said, the people shall have the right to graze their animals in forests, even on private property, and that they shall have the right to gather wood from each other's fields to be used as animal fodder, and that they shall have the right to gather wild vegetation for animal fodder in any place except for a field of fenugreek, and that they shall have the right to pluck off a shoot anywhere for propagation and planting, except for olive shoots, and that the people of the city shall have the right to take supplies of water from a spring on private property, even from a spring that emerges for the first time, and that they shall have the right to fish in the Sea of Tiberias, meaning the Sea of Galilee, provided that the fisherman does not build an underwater fence to catch fish, thereby causing an impediment to boats. The Baraisa continues with the list of Joshua's 10 conditions, and people shall have the right to relieve themselves outdoors, so long as it's behind a fence, even in a field that is full of saffron, known as karkum. And they shall have the right to walk in permitted paths, i.e. those paths that cut through a private field throughout the summer until the second rainfall, when the crops begin to sprout. Then they have to walk around the field. And they shall have the right to veer off to the sides of the roads onto private property because of hard protrusions of the road. And one who becomes lost among the vineyards shall have the right to cut down branches and enter an area of the vineyard, or cut down branches and exit an area of the vineyard until he finds his way back to the road. And that a corpse with no one to bury it, known as the mes mitzvah, acquires its place and is buried where it was found, right? So even there's this unattended corpse. It's a major mitzvah to bury an unattended corpse, that even a Kohen Gadol, right, the high priest, who is not allowed to become tameh, ritually impure, through contact with a corpse, even with his family members, but for some stranger that he never met before, but is a corpse just lying there, and the Kohen Gadol walks by, and he's the only one available, to dig a hole and bury that corpse, he will do that. He's obligated to do that. And the place where that corpse is found, even if it's somebody's field, they're going to dig that grave and put him there. Okay. Now we're going to skip forward a little bit and skip over the discussion among the sages of limitations on these 10 stipulations that Joshua enacted when he apportioned the land of Eretz Yisrael among the tribes. And we're going to pick this up on page 81b, kind of halfway down. And so the Gemara returns to the opening statement of the Baraisa that Joshua stipulated 10 conditions. And the Gemara says, are there really only 10? These conditions enumerated in the Baraisa are actually 11. You said there were 10, but there's 11 in the Baraisa. So the Gemara answers, the condition that one may walk in permitted paths that cut through a private field in the summer was not instituted by Joshua. Rather, it was instituted by Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon. As it is taught in a Baraisa, if one's produce was completely harvested from the field, but he does not allow people to enter into his field as a shortcut, what do people say about him? They say, what benefit does so-and-so have by denying entry into his field? And what harm are people causing him by traversing his field? Concerning him, the verse says, do not be called wicked by refraining from being good. And the Gemara asks, is it really written, do not be called wicked by refraining from being good? There is no such verse in the Bible. And the Gemara answers, well, yes, an idea like this is found in the Bible, albeit in a slightly different form, as it is written like this, Proverbs 3:27, withhold not good from him to whom it is due, when it is in the power of your hand to do it. Right? So if you have an opportunity to do good for another, like your field is lying fallow, it's not the planting, the growing season, it's not going to harm you in any way, that people can save, a 5-mile walk by cutting across your field. So you let them do it because it doesn't cost you anything. And why would you be so, stingy that you wouldn't let people cut through when it costs you nothing? Then the Gemara will list a few other stipulations of the same kind that are enacted for the public good. And we skip over to page 82a near the top. So the sages taught that Ezra, the scribe, right, who led the Jews back to commence the Second Temple period after the Babylonian exile, the sages taught that Ezra the scribe instituted 10 ordinances, right? So again, just like Joshua had done at the beginning of the Jews living in the Promised Land after exiting Egypt, now Ezra institutes 10 ordinances when they return from the Babylonian exile. And he instituted that communities read the Torah on Shabbos in the afternoon, and they also read the Torah on every Monday and Thursday. Now, we do that, right? So this is a practice that Ezra instituted and that we still do it. We read the whole weekly Torah portion on Saturday morning. And then on Saturday afternoon, we start the next week's Torah portion. We just read the beginning of it. And then we'll read that beginning of that next week's Torah portion again on Monday morning and on Thursday morning. So I think it's great, I feel, to be connected to history in this very active, living way, right? So earlier when it said that Shlomo HaMelech, that King Solomon instituted that you could walk through a field when it's, not being used, and that's still on the books, right? You think of King Solomon as such a long time ago. I mean, we know he built the first temple. It's not like there's any question that this is some kind of imaginary character. Obviously, he's a real historical figure. But the fact that a king that lived 2,500 years ago, that his laws are still on the books, pretty amazing. And here that Ezra, just a few hundred years later, passes, an ordinance that we still enact, right, in our weekly practice. I mean, I think it's very special. And the courts convene and judge every Monday and Thursday. And one does laundry on Thursday. And one eats garlic on Erev Shabbos. And Ezra further instituted that a woman should rise early and bake bread on those days when she wants to bake. And that a woman should don a breechcloth, and that a woman should first comb her hair and only then immerse in a mikveh after being ritually impure. And that peddlers of cosmetics and perfumes should travel around through all the towns. And Ezra further instituted the requirement of immersion for those who experienced a seminal emission. right? And there's people who still hold by that, that is not in a, it's not a mikveh. They're Hasidic men who immerse in the mikveh every day. They don't make a bracha, right? It's not an obligatory immersion, so there's no, it's not a mitzvah, so they don't recite a blessing for it. Here in modern times, the only people that recite a blessing for immersing in the mikveh, in the ritual bath, are women, right? Monthly, after they have had their monthly period, and then they count the 7 clean days so that whole period, the husband and wife are prohibited to each other. Then she immerses in the mikveh and says the blessing over that, and then it's date night for the husband and wife. And a ger tzedek, the convert, right? So when somebody converts to Judaism, then they immerse in the mikveh, and that's an obligatory immersion. But there are many who have the practice, some, like I said, to do it every day, some to do it every Friday afternoon before Shabbos. Most observant Jews will immerse at least before Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, or often all holidays. You can learn more about that by learning the laws of mikveh. Okay, so the Gemara analyzes these ordinances, the first of which is that communities shall read the Torah on Shabbos afternoon. And the Gemara explains that this ordinance was instituted due to those who sit idly on street corners, who do not attend the synagogue during the week. And the Gemara discusses the second of Ezra's ordinances, and that they should read the Torah on every Monday and Thursday during morning prayers. And the Gemara asked, did Ezra institute this practice? But it was instituted from the beginning, i.e. long before his time. As it is taught in the Baraisa with regard to the verse, and Moses led Israel onward from the Red Sea, and they went out into the wilderness of Shur, and they went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. And those who interpret verses metaphorically said that water here is referring to nothing other than Torah, as it is stated metaphorically concerning those who desire wisdom. Ho, everyone who thirsts, come for water. Isaiah 55:1. So the Baraisa continues, that verse means that since the Jews traveled for 3 days without hearing any Torah, they became weary, and therefore the prophets among them arose and instituted for them that they should read from the Torah every Shabbos, and pause on Sunday, and read again on Monday, and pause on Tuesday and Wednesday, and read again on Thursday, and pause on Erev Shabbos, which is Friday, so that they would not tarry 3 days without hearing the Torah. So evidently this practice predates Ezra. And the Gemara answers, initially they instituted that one man read 3 verses, or alternatively that 3 men read 3 verses. Either way, the number 3 corresponds to the 3 types of Jews: Kohanim, the priests; Leviim, the Levites; and the Israelites, everyone else. So Ezra later came and instituted that 3 men always read, and that 10 verses altogether be read by them, corresponding to the 10 idlers in a city, i.e. the 10 men who are paid to spend their time dealing with synagogue and communal matters, right? And so that's what we read is 10 verses on Saturday afternoon and on Monday and Thursday morning. And so, maybe they were reading before that, but he sort of institutionalized how much we would read, and the idea that there would be a Cohen Aliyah, a Levi Aliyah, and a Yisrael Aliyah, which, we still do that. Where am I? Okay, so the next ordinance of Ezra is, and the courts convene and judge every Monday and Thursday. And the Gemara explains that the reason for this ordinance is that many people are found in a city on these days as they come from the countryside for the reading of the Holy Book, the Torah, which is performed on Mondays and Thursdays as stated above. And some would say, well, they were coming on Mondays and Thursdays to bring their produce to market, and while they're in town, they should hear Torah. And others would say, well, no, let's give the people the benefit of the doubt. They're bringing their produce to the city because they're coming to hear the Torah on Monday and Thursday. And the Brisa teaches, and that one should do laundry on Thursday. And this was instituted due to the need to have clean garments in deference to Shabbos, right? We say that your clothes on Shabbos should not be like your clothes of the rest of the week, and your speech on Shabbos should not be like your speech on the rest of the week. And the Gemara explains the next listed ordinance, and that one should eat garlic on Erev Shabbos. And this is due to the fact that garlic enhances sexual potency. And Friday night is an appropriate time for conjugal relations. As it is written concerning the righteous, and he shall be like a tree planted by the streams of water, who brings forth his fruit in his season. Psalm 1:3. And Rabbi Yehuda says, and some say that it was Rav Nachman, and some say that it was Rav Kahana, and some say that it was Rabbi Yochanan who said, this is referring to one who engages in sexual intercourse every Shabbos night, meaning Friday night is the time. And the sages taught in a Baraisa that 5 matters were stated with regard to garlic. It satisfies, it warms the body, it causes one's countenance to shine, it increases one's sperm, and it kills lice that are in the intestines. And some say that it also instills love in those who eat it and removes jealousy from them. The next ordinance is, and that a woman should rise early and bake bread on those days when she bakes. Right? So it doesn't mean she has to bake, but if she bakes, she should rise early to bake. And the Gemara explains that this was instituted so that the bread should be available for poor people who go begging for bread in the mornings. And the Baraisa further teaches, and that a woman should don a breechcloth known as a sinar. And this ordinance was instituted due to reasons of modesty. What is a breechcloth? What is a sinar? The source of this word is not known for certain. Some maintain that it is the form of the Greek word zonarian, which is a diminutive form of a term that means, among other things, a belt or a girdle. And the sinar referred to by the sages is apparently a kind of undergarment. And the Baraisa adds, and that a woman should first comb her hair and only then immerse in the mikveh, the ritual bath. And this is to ensure that there is no dirt or other substance in the hair that would invalidate the immersion. When you immerse in a mikveh, you have to be naked because there can't be anything between you and the purifying water of the mikveh. As it is taught in a Baraisa concerning, and this is to ensure that there's no dirt or other substance in the hair that would invalidate the immersion. But the Gemara questions that Ezra actually did this in this ordinance. This is required by Torah law. Ezra did not institute this, as it is taught in a Baraisa concerning a verse that discusses one who must undergo immersion in the mikveh, Leviticus 14:9, and he shall bathe his flesh, es besaro, in water. And this verse teaches that no substance should interpose between his flesh and the water. And when the verse states this in the expanded form of es his flesh, right, or more modern, more Israeli pronunciation, Sephardic pronunciation, et his flesh. So using the term et, this teaches that the water must come into contact even with that which is subordinate to his flesh. And what is that? It is one's hair. So accordingly, the Torah itself states that there may not be any interposing substance in the hair at the time of the immersion. So what then did Ezra add? And the sages answer, by Torah law, one is required to inspect his or her hair before immersion, as perhaps some hairs are knotted together, preventing contact with water at that spot, or perhaps there is some repulsive substance in the hair. So one must perform this inspection because these would constitute an interposition. And so therefore, Ezra came and added to the Torah's minimal obligation by instituting the requirement of combing the hair, even when it is known that it is not knotted and contains no repulsive substance, to make sure. Now the Gemara discusses the next of Ezra's ordinances, and we are on page 82b. and that peddlers should circulate through all the towns. And the Gemara explains that this is because the peddlers supply women's cosmetics, and therefore Ezra instituted this practice so that women should not become unattractive to their husbands. Right? So it's a mitzvah to look beautiful. And the Gemara analyzes the last of the 10 ordinances, and he instituted the requirement of immersion for those who experienced a seminal emission. Obviously, this is for men. And the Gemara asks, but this is required by Torah law, as it is written, and if the flow of seed go out from a man, then he shall bathe all his flesh in water. Leviticus 15:16. And the Gemara answers, by Torah law, immersion is required only if one wishes to partake of teruma or sacrificial meat. You don't have to be tahor, in a state of ritual purity, unless you're going to eat teruma or sacrificial meat. But Ezra came and further instituted that immersion is necessary even for reciting or studying matters of Torah. New subject. The Mishna teaches that one may not raise chickens in Jerusalem. So the Gemara cites a baraisa that contains a list of other halachas, other laws that are unique to Jerusalem. 10 matters were stated with regard to Jerusalem. A house situated in Jerusalem does not become irredeemable 1 year after its sale. Right? Those who sell houses in other walled cities have the right to buy back their property for 1 year after the transaction, and if they fail to do so, the house becomes the permanent possession of the buyer. We learned that in Leviticus 25, verses 29 and 30. But this law does not apply to houses in Jerusalem, right? They would always have the right to buy them back. And its elders, the elders of Jerusalem, do not bring a heifer whose neck is broken, as required when a murder victim is found near a city and the murderer is unknown. So we've talked about that law before, that the elders of the first they have to measure which is the nearest city to where the murder victim's corpse was found, and then the elders of that city have to come and recite an oath that they didn't kill, that no one from their city that is known to them killed this murder victim. And we've discussed at other times why that law is in place. Very interesting law. Like, why don't you bring the usual suspects? Why don't you bring the local criminals to swear that they didn't kill? Why would you bring in the most prominent, and respectable men of the city to say we didn't kill? And it's interpreted to mean that, perhaps this person was alone, didn't have a place to stay, and that's why he ended up vulnerable between towns and became a murder victim. And what they're really attesting is that we're not the kind of city where if somebody was in need of a place to sleep for the night, that we would have all turned him away. At any rate, that is a law that applies to all the other cities and all the other areas of Israel, but not Jerusalem itself. And the city of Jerusalem cannot become an idolatrous city. Right? So what is an idolatrous city? This is a city in which the majority of inhabitants worship idolatry. So the city is judged by the Great Sanhedrin, which is the court of 71 that would meet in the chamber of hewn stone when the temple is standing. And the Sanhedrin has the authority to send an army to subdue a city, right, a Jewish city that has become a city steeped in avodah zarah, in idolatry. And this is a stain, right, on the land of Israel when the land of Israel is under Jewish, not just Jewish dominion, but Torah dominion. And so then in that situation, the Sanhedrin sends this army to subdue the city, and afterward courts are convened, and every one of the city's adult inhabitants is judged. And those found to be guilty of avodah zarah, which is a capital offense, are beheaded rather than stoned, which is the usual punishment for idolatry. And the innocent are not slain. All the property in the city, including that of the righteous, is destroyed, and all its buildings are razed, and it remains in ruins forever. Right? It's a very strong incentive that's written out in the Torah for a city, not to become an idolatrous city. It's bad enough when there are idolaters, Jews who become idolaters within the land and committing a capital offense. But if the problem gets so out of control that an entire city becomes an idolatrous city, you see, you go in, you kill all the idolaters, and completely level the city, and it's never rebuilt because it's such a stain on the land. I don't know if there ever was an idolatrous city, a city that was deemed idolatrous and destroyed at the order of the sages. But at any rate, that law would never apply to Jerusalem, even if Jerusalem became, filled with a majority of idolaters, Jews who had become idolaters. We still would not destroy Jerusalem under this law. God might do it, but we wouldn't. Now, the Baraisa continues its list of special laws that apply to Jerusalem. And a house in Jerusalem cannot become ritually impure with the impurity of tsaras, and one may not build out projections or balconies from houses that are in it, and one may not establish garbage dumps in Jerusalem, and one may not build kilns, right? Kilns for firing pottery in it, and one may not plant gardens and orchards in it, except for the rose gardens that were already there from the times of the early prophets, and one may not raise chickens in it. And finally, one may not leave a corpse overnight in Jerusalem. It needs to be buried ASAP. So the Gemara discusses these 10 laws pertaining to Jerusalem one by one. A house situated in Jerusalem does not become irredeemable 1 year after its sale. And the reason is that it is written, and if it is not redeemed within the space of a full year, then the house that is in the walled city shall be made sure in perpetuity to him who bought it throughout his generations. Leviticus 25:30. And the Tana who taught this Baraisa maintains that Jerusalem was not apportioned to any single one of the tribes of Israel. Rather, it is considered common property to all of the tribes. And since no one has ancestral ownership of any house in Jerusalem, its houses cannot be sold permanently. And the Gemara analyzes the next law. And its inhabitants do not bring a heifer whose neck is broken, right, when the murder victim is found between cities. And the reason is that it is written, if one is found slain in the land that the Lord your God gives you to possess it, Deuteronomy 21:1. And again, the Tana who taught this Baraisa maintains that Jerusalem was not apportioned to any one of the tribes of Israel. Therefore, it is not included in the description, the land that the Lord your God gives you to possess it. Jerusalem is a joint possession of the Jewish people and not of any one tribe. And the Baraisa states, and it cannot become an idolatrous city. And the reason is that it is written in the introduction of the passage dealing with the law of an idolatrous city, quote, if you shall hear tell concerning one of your cities, which the Lord your God gives you to dwell there. And the Tana who taught the Baraisa said again, Jerusalem was not apportioned to any one of the tribes, therefore this law would not apply. And the Baraisa teaches, and a house in Jerusalem does not become tameh, ritually impure, with the impurity of tsaras, leprous sores. So the reason is that it is written, and I put the plague of leprosy in a house of the land of your possession, Leviticus 14:34. And again, the Tana who taught this Baraisa says that Jerusalem was not apportioned like the other cities, right? So we've seen tsaras, right, which doesn't exist anymore, but in ancient times it was a physical manifestation of a spiritual malady on the body or in a house, right? An actual house, the walls could develop, not mold, but tsaras, right? This physical expression of some kind of spiritual malady in the house, and they would have to bring a Kohen. And if he determined that the house indeed had tsaras, it's going to be a big problem. It's going to have to be torn down and rebuilt, and everything that was in the house would be problematic also. But sometimes when a house was deemed to have tsaras, which would be a huge problem for the homeowner, when they tore it down, they would find like treasure that was stashed there by the Canaanite nations before Joshua led the children of Israel into the land. And, spiritually we learn out from that sometimes the biggest difficulties that we have in life later, not when we're experiencing it, when it's so difficult, but later can prove to be, the opportunity and the life-changing opportunity that, God sent as a gift. So, it's something that can give us a little bit of hope when we're having the really, really tough times of life. Where am I? Houses become tsaras of a house. Okay, and one may not build out projections or balconies from houses that are in Jerusalem. And the Gemara provides two reasons for this prohibition. First, it is due to the danger of contracting tuma by being in the same tent as a corpse, i.e. under the same roof, in which case the impurity spreads to all items under that roof. So if even a small part of a corpse is under a balcony, everyone who passes under that balcony is rendered impure. And many people come to Jerusalem to sacrifice offerings when the temple is standing, and they must maintain a state of ritual purity. And the other reason is that those great crowds of pilgrims not be injured by colliding with the projection. So there's this sense that the way that Jerusalem is built has to keep, the builders of houses in Jerusalem have to keep in mind that Jerusalem is a city of the people, and so many people will come there on pilgrimage during the festivals, right? Pesach and Shavuos and Sukkot. So the next law pertaining to Jerusalem is that one may not establish garbage dumps in it, and the Gemara explains that this is due to the repugnant creatures that are attracted to such heaps, and in part, tuma when they die, right? So we shouldn't have little creeping things that now are going to impart tuma to all the people that are bringing sacrifices when the temple is standing. And one may not build kilns in Jerusalem, and the reason is due to the unsightly smoke produced by kilns, and the sages sought to preserve the beauty of Jerusalem and the temple. And one may not plant gardens and orchards in it. And this is due to the odor emitted by these places, either from discarded weeds or from fertilizer. And one may not raise chickens in Jerusalem. And this is due to the sacrificial meat that is consumed in Jerusalem, right? When people bring peace offerings, part of it goes onto the altar, but the rest is eaten in a state of joy during the festivals. And that's sacrificial meat, so it has to be eaten in a state of purity, both the meat and the person who's eating it. And since chickens peck in the garbage, they are likely to pick up items that impart ritual impurity and bring them into contact with consecrated food, which may not be eaten in an impure state. And the Gemara discusses the last halacha. One may not leave a corpse overnight in Jerusalem, and the Gemara notes this prohibition is a tradition. There is no known explanation for it. Okay, just going to go forward a little more. The Mishna teaches that one may not raise pigs anywhere. And the sages taught in a baraisa the background for this law when the members of the house of the Hasmonean monarchy were at war with each other. Hyrcanus, one of the parties to this war, was inside the besieged Jerusalem, while his brother Aristobulus, the other contender to that throne, was on the outside of Jerusalem. And every day the people inside the city would lower down money in a box from the temple walls in order to purchase sheep to make the daily sacrifice in the temple. And those on the other side would take the money and send up sheep to them over the wall for the daily offerings. Right? So in other words, you had a civil war among the Jews during the Hasmonean times. Right? So this would be later than the Hanukkah story. And even though the Jews were at war with each other, all agreed that it was necessary for the Jewish people to keep the daily sacrifices going in the temple. And since Jerusalem was besieged, both the people inside the wall and outside the wall cooperated to keep bringing the daily offerings. Now, there was a certain elder among the army outside of Jerusalem who was familiar with Greek wisdom, right? So meaning he was not a very pious Jew when he made this suggestion. And he said to those besieging Jerusalem, well, as long as the people inside Jerusalem occupy themselves with the temple service, they will not be delivered into your hands. So the next day, when those inside the city lowered down the money in a box as usual to get the sheep to sacrifice that day, the people on the outside sent them up a pig. And when the pig reached the midpoint of the temple wall as it was being raised, over the wall, it stuck its hooves into the wall. And Eretz Yisrael, the whole land of Israel, quaked over an area of 400 parasangs by 400 parasangs, right? 400 miles by 400 miles, more or less. There was an earthquake that was felt because a pig had been attempted to be brought into the city of Jerusalem. They didn't even get it in, but when its hooves struck the wall of Jerusalem, there was an earthquake throughout the land. And at that time the sages said, "Cursed be the man who raises pigs, and cursed be the man who teaches his son Greek wisdom." And it was concerning that time of siege that we learned in a Mishna. There was an incident in which the barley for the Omer offering came from the gardens of Tseraphin, far from Jerusalem, and the wheat for the 2 loaves of Shavuos was brought from the valley of Ein Socher. And barley and wheat could not be brought from any nearer because the besiegers had destroyed all the produce around Jerusalem. And this concludes the Baraisa. Now the Gemara asks a question with regard to this Baraisa, and is it really prohibited to study Greek wisdom? But isn't it taught in a Baraisa that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, the redactor of the Mishnah, that he said in Eretz Yisrael, now we're on page 83a, why should one speak the Syriac language? One should speak either Lashon Kodesh, the sacred tongue, meaning Hebrew, or the Greek language. And Rabbi Yosef said similarly in Babylonia, why should one speak Aramaic? One should speak either Lashon Kodesh, right, Hebrew, or the Persian language. At any rate, Rebbe's statement indicates that there is nothing wrong with learning and speaking Greek. And the sages say in response, the Greek language is discrete and Greek wisdom is discrete. In other words, there are 2 separate issues. Only Greek wisdom is prohibited, not the Greek language. And so the Gemara further pursues this line of inquiry, and is Greek wisdom itself actually prohibited? But doesn't Rav Yehuda say that Shmuel says in the name of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, it is written, my eye affected my soul because of all the daughters of my city, Lamentations 3:51. And Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel applied this verse to a personal tragedy. There were 1,000 children in the household of my father, Rabban Gamliel. 500 of them studied the Torah, and 500 of them studied Greek wisdom. And all of them were killed by Romans. And the only ones that remain of them are I, who is here, and the son of my father's brother, who is in Asia Minor. And Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel's statement indicates that it is permitted to study Greek wisdom. And the sages say in response, the household of Rabban Gamliel is different, as they held close ties with the government. Since knowledge of Greek wisdom was crucial for the members of this family, the sages exempted them from the general decree, as it is taught in a Baraisa with regard to one who cuts his hair in the fashion of komi, a certain haircut favored by the Romans. This is considered one of the ways of the Amorites, i.e. a Gentile practice prohibited by Torah law. And despite this, the sages permitted Avtalmos bar Reuven to cut his hair in the fashion of komi, because he had close ties with the government. And likewise, they permitted the members of the household of Rabban Gamliel to discuss matters of Greek wisdom because they had close ties with the government, right? So they didn't have sovereignty over the land of Israel. They were subjects of the Greek Empire and later the Roman Empire. So they had to deal with the government, and the people who specifically had the responsibility of dealing with the government had to know how to not only speak the language of Greek, but to understand the thinking and customs of the Greek governors and administrators. So they were among the Jewish people who had to know Greek wisdom, but that was an exceptional case. Otherwise, the sages didn't want the people to get involved with Greek wisdom because it would pull them away from a life of Torah. And actually, we're going to cut off there. And tomorrow, like I said, rather than continue, we're running about 2 days behind the actual Daf Yomi schedule. But tomorrow's Daf, page 83, here in Tractate Bava Kamma, is going to be a key Daf because we just have a few paragraphs left here in chapter 7. And then we're going to jump over to chapter 8, which is known as Perek HaChovel. And that is a fascinating discussion where we're going to get into how the sages derive that when the Torah says an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, it doesn't mean that when somebody injures someone and they lose an eye, that the court steps in and removes an eye from the defendant. Rather, it means monetary damages. And that discussion is a sort of critical Talmudic discussion and one, which shows that people who say, well, an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind, Yeah, it's a nice saying, but it has nothing to do with Jewish law because we would never take an eye from somebody that caused an injury to somebody else's eye. And how the sages derive that is both fascinating and very important for us in our journey to follow closely the logic used therein. Okay, let's take a few questions on Bava Kamma 80 through 82 that we covered today. Okay, Bill. So, in most of Europe, at least, and I believe elsewhere, but European history is where my information is strongest, the norm was that sheep herds were fed on commons, land collectively owned by the community, and presumably the logic is similar, and the herds need a lot of grazing space. And as a practical matter, that means they may either be raised in a large common land or they will inevitably enter and graze other folks' land. Also can confirm the sage's wisdom on chickens. They can and will eat everything. Feathered piranhas, truly. Yeah, Bill, I'm sure that you're quite familiar, with the history, much more modern history than what we're talking about here. I've read about it, how it went down in England. Where you would have, let's say, the lord of the manor, right, and then the peasants who were under his jurisdiction, and then there was the common, right. So the common is a place where their sheep herds could eat, where people could go hunting, etc. And at a certain point in history, the aristocrats needed more cash for whatever various ventures they were getting involved in. And they fenced in the commons and started to develop that land for the benefit, right, of the population of that area. But of course, it proved to be anything but a benefit to the populations of that area. Great discussion about that process by Patrick O'Brien in the Aubrey Maturin books, but that's total digression. We'll move on. Sharon. The reality is, however, that they did keep dogs for herding, and a breed unique to the area was developed and is still around called Canaanite dogs. The Bedouins to this day still keep these dogs in their home. In fact, in the Torah, prior to the 10th plague, dogs are mentioned, very good, as being obedient and silent and not interfering with the execution of the plague. And it is for this reason, according to tradition, that we feed our dogs prior to feeding the people. Exactly. And that the dogs are mentioned specially in the Torah, that, there are certain things that you can't benefit from, but you can feed it to your dog. Right, so just certain classes of meat. I don't know. I think maybe like a nevela, right, a carcass that you could feed it to your dog. You can't eat it yourself. And the dog is mentioned specifically as receiving some benefit under Torah law because, right, at the time of the plagues in Egypt, the dogs are mentioned specifically as being silent at that time. And not barking. And this would imply, right, that people had dogs in order to give them this benefit. I think this is more in the nature of farm dogs, etc. And like I said, it's still pretty uncommon in the frum world, in the Orthodox world, to find people keeping dogs as pets, but definitely not something you never find. It's just less common, I would say, than in the rest of the population. Some people have dogs, but they're a little bit sheepish, as it were, the bad keeping dogs. And in the non-Orthodox world, people have dogs. And Sharon says, one of my co-workers in the past was a very traditionally Orthodox Jew from South Africa, and he said to me that traditional Jews not having dogs or pets is not prevalent outside of the U.S., and this is more typical here than in other countries. He had a dog growing up and is very upset that he is being discouraged from doing so with his kids in Lakewood, New Jersey, where he now lives, and it is discouraged, as I mentioned. Okay, so that's what I've got for us today. Today's Thursday, so tune in tomorrow, Friday, at the regular Friday time, noon Pacific, for a key daf as we'll open chapter 8, the very famous chapter 8 of Tractate Bava Kamma, and we'll get into the nitty-gritty of what an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth really means.